I'd like to commence by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to elders from other communities who may be here today. Thank you for attending this forum on the 2018 Caretaker Guidelines. My name is Toby Hemming. I'm General Counsel at the Department of Premier and Cabinet. This forum is intended to provide you with an overview of the Caretaker Conventions that apply in advance of November's state election. It's also designed to help facilitate a level of familiarity with DPC's guidelines on the conventions, which have recently been published online. I'm joined today by three presenters. Our first speaker is my colleague from the Office of the General Counsel, Elsie Lowe. Elsie will talk generally about what the Caretaker Conventions are and why we have them, and then she'll talk in some detail about the principal conventions that apply during the caretaker period. Our second speaker is Jonathan Burke from DPC's Cabinet Office. Jonathan will talk about the required processes for the management and handling of Cabinet documents. And our third speaker today is Louise Cleary from the Victorian Public Sector Commission. Louise will talk about the behavioural standards required of public sector employees during the caretaker period. Elsie will then return to the podium to run us through some case studies. And following that, if we have time, there'll be an opportunity for some questions. So I'll now invite Elsie to the podium. Thanks, Elsie.
Thanks for the attempt. I appreciate it. So Toby's already kind of gone through to just kind of set out what we're going to cover today, so I won't go through again. But I'll get straight into it. So, caretaker conventions. I know it's a Friday afternoon, but I know I can see the excitement in your eyes. So, what are caretaker conventions? They're normative guides to behaviour by the executive branch and public servants during the period that precedes an election, so during the caretaker period. So, as Toby mentioned, we've published guidelines on the website. So if you haven't accessed them, I really strongly recommend you to just get them, print them out, read through them. They are a wealth of information and really good, that is really good guidance material, but I'll cover some things from there today, but I will be referring you back to the guidelines in several places. So in terms of the caretaker conventions, they work to regulate ministers and public servants. And as far as they relate to ministers, the operation of the guidelines is dependent on voluntary observance. So for ministers, the risk of non-compliance is more political rather than legal. The conventions, however, are binding on VPS staff. So when I say VPS, I mean the Victorian Public Sector. And this is because by the operation of the Public Administration Act and the Code of Conduct, which Louise will speak more about, public servants are bound to comply with the relevant policies and protocols that are issued by their employer, and the 2018 Caretaker Convention Guidelines is one such document. So why do we have caretaker conventions? So the application of the convention is an art and not a science, so it is critical to actually understand the purpose that they serve. So these are some valid reasons. It recognises that at every state election there is actually a possibility that there is a change of government. So the Caretaker Convention seeks to prevent the incumbent government from attempting to bind an incoming government or limits its freedom of action. It also recognises that the incumbent government should not have more access to resources of the state than others seeking election, and that the government functions and essential services must continue. And indeed, the majority of business of government should continue in the usual manner throughout the caretaker period. It is also important to protect the impartiality and independence of the public service. And once Parliament is dissolved, it's recognised that the government can no longer be held accountable to, in the usual way for its actions. So, when is the caretaker period? You can see on the timeline that the caretaker period starts on the 30th of October 2018 at 6 p.m. And that's set out under the Constitution. This is unless the Legislative Assembly is dissolved earlier. The caretaker conventions do not apply before the caretaker period. Accordingly, the conventions have actually no work to do before this time. The VPS should not attempt to preempt the outcome of an election and should not modify its administration of government policy in anticipation of a change of government. However, of course, it's important that we prepare for it, and that's why we are here today. So, as you can see, it's clear when it starts. This is 25 days. It's clear, up to election day. Beyond that, it really depends on the outcome of the election results. So there are multiple ways that the caretaker period may end. The timing of this will depend on the way the caretaker concludes. So in circumstances when an incoming government is returned, the caretaker period can end when the leader of the opposition concedes defeat, when it is clear that the government has won sufficient seats to form government, or where an incumbent government forms a minority government following an election. The caretaker period will end when public statements by relevant stakeholders have been made which confirm an agreement for the formation of a minority government, or, if necessary, following a vote in the Legislative Assembly which confirms that the government can guarantee supply and confidence. In the cases where the government does change, the caretaker period ends when the incoming government is sworn in, so it's much clearer. And this is regardless of the scale of the incoming government's victory or the circumstances in which it forms government. So, there are 5 principal conventions covered by the caretaker guidelines, which are set out on the screen. In summary, these provide that during the caretaker period, the government should avoid implementing major policy decisions that are likely to bind an incoming government, avoid making significant appointments, avoid entering major contracts of undertakings, manage intergov negotiations and visits, and protect the apolitical nature of the public service. So I'll go into more detail with each aspect of these. So in terms of major policy decisions, as I mentioned before, the government should avoid implementing major policy decisions during the caretaker period which would bind an incoming government to that course. And obviously this convention's not black and white. The question of whether the policy is major and whether it has been implemented will vary on a case-by-case basis. So relevant considerations include the significance of the decision in terms of policy and resources, and whether the decision is a matter of contention between the government and the opposition in the election campaign. The one thing to note is that this convention is directed towards prohibiting the implementation of a decision only. And there is no prohibition on the government making a decision during the caretaker period if that act can readily be reversed. So such decisions or policy announcements are likely to be routine in the course of the caretaker period. So, I should have warned you guys. I'm going to now get you guys to engage in, so audience participation basically is required. First hypothetical, there's an announcement by government that they would spend $5 million to buy back and remediate land on Phillip Island that had been affected by dry land salinity. Who thinks that this is permissible? If you think yes, put up your hand. If you think no, put up your hand. A lot of people not very non-committal. It is permissible. And the reason for this is because it's an announcement only. Okay, it's different if it's actually doing it. They're actually spending the money, they're actually going to buy it, etc. They're actually implementing it. In this case, it's just an announcement. Next one. Implementation of a new policy of a $30,000 grant for first-time electric car owners. And let's just assume that there is a bigger budget amount set aside for this. Who thinks that's permissible during the caretaker period? Put up your hand. Who thinks it's not permissible? Put up your hand. Oh, you guys are really, really good. Well done. I've done my job. Anyway, now I'll keep going. It gets harder, maybe not. Significant appointments. So the government should avoid making a significant public appointment during the caretaker period. Okay, if the appointment will continue, that is if the appointment will commence during or after the caretaker period. Okay, as an extension of this principle, appointments decided before the caretaker period must commence before the caretaker period. So when considering whether an appointment qualifies as significant, the agency or department should consider the length of the appointment, the seniority of the appointment, the importance of the position. So consider, for example, the functions, responsibilities, and any powers of the appointees, or the position's recognition and status within the community and industry. So whether an appointment is made under legislation, whether the proposed appointment is likely to be controversial, and whether the appointment is one that would be considered by Cabinet. So whether an appointment is significant is ultimately a decision for the relevant departmental secretary and minister. So if it is determined that an appointment is not significant, then the regular process of appointments should occur. There may be some situations and circumstances which might make it impractical to defer an appointment or a significant appointment. And so consideration should be given to the following options. So number one, an acting appointment is made where permissible, or a short-term appointment is made shortly after the likely end of the caretaker period, or if those options are not practicable, a full-time appointment is made preceded by consultation with the opposition. Okay, you know what comes next. It's a pop quiz. Number one, a one-year appointment to an exec committee advising on the refurbishment of one Treasury Place. Who thinks that's okay? Who thinks that's not okay? We think it's okay. It's a non-statutory committee. It's about refurbishments. Okay, it's not necessarily about any other decisions, more substantial. Okay, next one, appointment of the VEC for a full term. Who thinks that's okay? Who thinks that's not okay? Okay, that's not okay. Okay, major contracts and undertakings. So the government should not enter into major contracts or undertakings during the caretaker period. As with the convention relating to major policy decisions, the question of whether a contract is major will depend on the circumstances. So we've set out some indices, such as dollar value of the commitment, whether the commitment is routine expenditure or implements a policy, program, or admin structure which may be politically contentious, and whether the commitment requires ministerial approval or a public tender process. Okay, where circumstances might dictate that the major policy decision must be implemented or major contracts must be entered into, potential options are: the government may make a decision after consultation with the opposition, allowing a reasonable time for a response. So in this case, the government actually don't need the opposition's agreement, but just need to consult. Agencies could explain to the relevant contractor the implication of the election and ensure that the contracts include clauses including termination in the event of an incoming government not wishing to proceed. And where contracts have been entered into prior to the caretaker period, further agreements can be entered into during that period if they are subsidiary to that head contract relating to matters already proceeding, or penalties may incur for breach if further agreements are not entered into. So hypothetical, number one, a department entering into a contract worth $25,000 for an order of stationery for ordinary departmental use. Who thinks that's okay? Who thinks that's not okay? Entering into a contract to purchase $10 million worth of materials for the construction of a multi-complex sports stadium in Ballarat. Who thinks that's okay? Very good. Apart from the person from Ballarat, who thinks it's not okay? I sense you're just, there's a trend that you've noticed. Okay, intergovernmental negotiations and visits. So the government should not entrench a policy position in the course of intergov negotiations during the caretaker period. The government ordinarily would seek to defer intergov negotiations or adopt observer status until the end of the caretaker period. So if deferring involvement or adopting observer status is not feasible, the government should limit its role to providing information on its position as settled before the commencement of the caretaker period without committing the incoming government to that position. So if it is necessary for the government to participate fully in the negotiations, it should advise the other parties to the negotiations that any outcome will need to be authorised by the incoming government, or consult with the opposition to seek their agreement or endorsement on the negotiating positions. For visits by dignitaries or officials involving government hospitality, they may occur during the caretaker period, but those dignitaries or officials should be advised of the special arrangements in place during the caretaker period and the possibility of a change of government. This time, I'm going to get people to stand up, just to wake you guys up. The first one is a minister hosting the President of Finland for lunch, lacking any policy discussion, negotiation or commitments. If you think that's okay, please stand up. I'll show you the answer to encourage you to stand up. Stay standing. Oh, stay standing. The next one, attending COAG and negotiating with the Commonwealth on terms of an intergov agreement. If you think that's not okay, please sit down. If you think that's okay, stand up. No, yeah. You shouldn't do that. Okay, apolitical nature. Okay, it is critical that the business of government continues. Okay, during the caretaker period, we just can't suddenly stop, basically. However, it is particularly important for the VPS to be, and to be seen to be, apolitical during the caretaker period. This is to ensure that controversies about the role of the VPS do not distract from the substantive issues of the election campaign, and also to protect the reputation of the VPS and to ensure the VPS remains trusted by the incoming government. So some activities that are ordinarily performed by the VPS may be or be seen to be controversial or political in the context of an election. So agencies should assess whether any of their ordinary functions, so such as distributing information about government policies and developing policies for ministers, may need to be performed differently during the caretaker period. The extent to which any particular departments or agencies' work may need to change is difficult to prescribe. It will depend on a case-by-case analysis and the application of sound judgment. However, we contemplate that particular attention will need to be paid to at least the following areas. So in terms of communication, advertising, electronic and internet content. So it's worthwhile noting that under there's a new Part 5A of the Public Administration Act that has been enacted and commenced since the last election. And basically this new Part 5A prescribes the requirements for the content of communication and advertising by public sector bodies. So in a nutshell, it must be ensured that any material distributed, whether printed or electronic, is published in the public interest and is not designed or intended to directly or indirectly influence public sentiment for or against a political party, a candidate for election, a member of parliament, the current government or the current government of the Commonwealth. So this Part 5A actually applies all the time. So this is not just in relation to the caretaker period. So if you don't know about it, look at it. But obviously, as I mentioned before, leading up to the election, things become, there's a heightened sense that there's some things that might be fine in the past might suddenly become controversial and political. So it is important that prior to the caretaker period, the agencies should review advertising and information campaigns that are scheduled to take place during the caretaker period, as well as all arrangements for the publication and distribution of material. So some examples of what will be permitted during the caretaker period, what's clearly okay, is advertising or information campaigns that convey necessary public information. So for example, promoting health and safety, or letting people know about public transport disruptions, or if there are campaigns that are operational in nature, so employment advertisements. And another example is advertising or promoting Victoria as a tourist destination. So if you are involved in the production or publication of government internet and electronic communications, I strongly recommend you to read the guidelines, because we've got substantial material in there about what you can or can't do and strategies for managing it, such as like disclaimers that you can use. And I particularly draw your attention to the things we talk about in relation to agency websites, ministerial websites, specific purpose websites for policies, events or initiatives that you need to think about whether they should still keep running, and other electronic communications such as electronic collaboration systems, intranets, email systems, social media platforms. So basically, the general principle is if we're running it, if there's public funds, being spent to keeping these going, then we have to be mindful about the content. Otherwise, agencies should not apply money towards any activity that directly or indirectly support electioneering efforts of the government, opposition, not a political party, other members of parliament, and other candidates for election. And in terms of hospitality and use of government premises, I refer you to the guidelines. I'm not going to go into detail, but there are some things, some circumstances when you can use government buildings. And in terms of Coro, we will have to change the way we respond to Coro during this period, and the guidelines go into detail as to things you need to consider. So in terms of engagement protocols, I want to talk about what should happen during this time with our engagement with ministers and ministerial officers. So these protocols will apply during the caretaker period, and agency heads are to establish consistent protocols with their private officers. So I encourage you to find out, what they are. But the key protocols are these, as I've set out here. These should be consistent in this way. So there should be a central coordination point within each VPS agency or department. So that's the secretary or the relevant agency head. There should be limited contact points in ministerial offices. So obviously ministers, their chiefs of staff, or if there are no chiefs of staff, a designated senior advisor. During this period, there should be a review of whether DLOs should continue during the caretaker period. DLOs can continue to act on an as-needs basis as per their defined non-policy role. So I refer you to the Premier's circular that is dated the 23rd of March 2015 to find out what their roles are and to stick to it. And in terms of meetings between ministers and ministerial officers and VPSs, and this includes the statutory agencies, these should not occur during this period unless there is a genuine need for the continuation of government. And the rationale for this is to ensure that there is limited, consistent and appropriate engagement between ministers and the VPS, and so that it will minimise the risk of any inappropriate advice being given. And this is in order to preserve the apolitical nature of the VPS. So there's engagement also in relation to non-government parties during this period. So, and even before that. So basically briefings, we can start briefing non-government parties in the 3 months leading up to the caretaker period. So from the 31st of July, 2018. And we can do this, the briefings have to relate to machinery of government and administrative matters only. So agency officers are not authorised to discuss government policies or to give opinions on matters of a party political nature. The discussions may include the administrative and technical practicalities and procedures involved in implementation of policies proposed by the non-government parties, and if the non-government representative raise matters which, in the judgment of the agency officers, seek information on government policies or expressions of opinion on alternative policies, the agency officers are to suggest that these matters be raised with the relevant minister. So these briefings can be requested by the Leader of the Opposition or the non-government parties through the Premier, or in relation to shadow ministers, these should be made to the relevant portfolio minister. provided that the Premier is also informed in those circumstances. So if the agency receives a direct request, they should refer this request to the Premier and any other relevant minister. And after it's been approved, agencies can organise the briefings, and in the lead up to the briefings, agencies should seek details of the likely topics for discussion ahead of the meeting, and this will help with the preparation for the briefing. So details of the matters discussed are actually confidential, but the ministers can seek confirmation that the discussions had occurred and also that they were consistent with the initial request and with these guidelines. In terms of who can or who can't attend, agency heads and a DPC representative nominated by the Secretary of DPC must attend. And if the agency is not a department, that relevant departmental secretary must also attend. Who may attend? One or more agency officers nominated by the relevant agency. And who cannot attend are the ministers and the ministerial officers. So we have covered the main principles contained in the Caretaker Guidelines. The Caretaker Guidelines, the Caretaker Conventions and Guidelines also bear on a number of matters that we have not covered today, and these are some of them. I encourage you to read them, and if there's any of them that we haven't covered that you've got a burning question, feel free to ask today or contact us, and we'll give you our further contact details at the end of this seminar. But in the meantime, I want to invite Jonathan Burke up to speak to everyone about Cabinet documents.
Oh, there we go. Got there in the end. Sympathy clap, I think. Thanks very much, Elsie. So I have the esteemed responsibility today to talk to you about managing CIC records, or Cabinet in Confidence records, for the caretaker period. So I know Cabinet and record management is everyone's favourite topic, so bear with me. So the Caretaker Guidelines, if you have had a look at them already, also briefly discuss record management, and that's the section in blue at the top of the slide there. Particularly the management of Cabinet in Confidence, or CIC material. The main point really is that CIC material belongs to the government of the day, and the Secretary of the Department of Premier and Cabinet is the custodian of that material. And the Cabinet Office, which is where I work, sort of leads that work across government. As we have become more digital, this has become much easier to manage with Cabinet folders and electronic record management systems and annual audits of material. You might be involved in support for Cabinet or committees through preparing submissions, briefings or coordination advice, or liaison, or indeed critical advice for a Cabinet or committee. So now we're sort of in early to mid-June. Now is a really good time to make sure that you're doing the right thing, because it is quite important, as we'll soon find out. So I'll talk about three main steps. And first is finding, second is managing, and the third is securing your CIC records. The next step after these three depends on the outcome of the election. So even though you may feel a high degree of ownership of material that you prepare for CIC records, it's important to remember that they actually belong to the state. They don't belong to us as public servants, even though we create them, we manage them. That we actually, these belong to the state. Cabinet Office and the Cabinet and parliamentary teams in each department do a lot to manage the final material that goes into the meeting rooms. However, there's also a lot of preparatory and draft material that you may have, and I know that you do, such as drafts and working papers for submissions, briefs regarding Cabinet items, draft agendas, our favourite thing, emails containing policy advice or direction or coordination advice. So I hate to tell you, but those emails are going to be quite important if they fall into one of two categories. A thorough search to find your records should include the following. So emails across all 4 years of the Andrews term of government. Now that's very fun and exciting for you, but it's very important. Corporate folders and drawers, filing cabinets and in trays. Now on the topic of filing cabinets, I'd just like to sort of make the point that before you ship it off to the salvos, can you actually just have a look inside to make sure there's nothing in there? It'd be good to clarify that, and we'd be very grateful in the Cabinet Office if you could do that for us. Managing your records will depend on their status. So the CIC material can be classified either as permanent or temporary. So permanent, permanent is when it contains original, policy, critical advice or significant content. Temporary includes things like duplicates or administrative material. Permanent material should be kept. Temporary material should be destroyed, and destroyed securely. For example, through secure bins or permanently deleted. So far I've not broken this, I'm very impressed. So to be fully prepared for post-election record management, departments will secure all CIC records by mid-November. Each department will advise staff of their specific internal dates. In DPC, CM9, Cabinet working folders will be locked from Friday the 2nd of November. This means that hard copies are physically locked up and electronic records are archived offline. For example, in DPC, the Cabinet system, the CM9 folders. If there is material that you need continued access to do your jobs, you need to seek formal approval, and this is based on strict criteria such as essential ongoing business, live FOI requests, or legal matters that are on foot. Your department cabinet team should be able to communicate the internal process to you, and this is regarding what needs to be retained, and that this requires approval from our secretary in the Department of Premier and Cabinet as custodian on behalf of the state of cabinet material. Records will remain locked until the election result is announced, and the Cabinet Office will notify departments essentially. Firstly, if the government is returned, CIC records will be unlocked and they'll be made readable again. Or if there is a change of government, CIC records will be transferred to Public Records Office of Victoria and held for 30 years before the public release. So in conclusion, there are 5 key tips I'd like to talk to you about. The first is to be clear about the arrangements after the election. So depending on the outcome of the election result will determine what happens with that CIC material. The second is to take responsibility for material that you have access to. As VPS employees, and if we handle CIC material on behalf of the Secretary, it is very important that we're clear about what that looks like and what our responsibilities are. Third, make sure your corporate files don't include CIC material. So it is important to check those corporate folders because invariably in the course of our work, and it can be busy work, as I'm sure you will agree, that we often put things in the wrong folder, and those corporate folders need to be checked. The fourth, give yourself enough time for digital searches and especially email. This is where I myself need to pay more attention. Those emails, we might not realise it, but throughout the working day, how much critical information that is important is contained in those emails. So research of your emails is really, really key. And finally, give yourself enough time to seek approval for retention. We completely agree and understand that in the course of our work and continuing to serve the government up until the caretaker period, we do need access to that CIC material. So in terms of getting that exemption, you must be clear about that to do it early. And that, mercifully, is me done. I would now like to introduce Louise Cleary, who's the Director of Integrity Advisory at the Victorian Public Sector Commission. Louise.
Thanks everyone. So just while we've got everyone in the room thinking about forthcoming elections and what does it mean to be apolitical, it's just a great opportunity to remind everybody about what's required to be an apolitical and professional public sector. And these requirements, of course, they are with us all the time in our public sector work, not just leading up to an election, but they become particularly relevant, I suppose, as we come closer to election time. So, sorry, I'll just, which button, that one. Just to step back a bit, we've got lots of very experienced public sector employees in the room, and you'll understand this, but let's, I guess it's an opportunity for you to go back and have conversations with your colleagues and for us to remind ourselves of why we need to be apolitical. We're part of a Westminster system. There's 2, I guess, fundamental concepts for a Westminster system. One of them is separation of powers and one of them is responsible government. So separation of powers means that no one branch of government is more powerful than the other. Responsible government means that the Premier and the Ministers are accountable to Parliament, and of course Parliament is accountable to the people of Victoria. So this is how the system works. The executive branch is made up of the Governor, the Premier, Ministers and the public sector, and this is why the public sector needs to be apolitical. A Westminster-based public sector is a career-based profession where employees are appointed on merit and offer impartial service to ministers. These values give Parliament and the public confidence that employees will serve the government of the day and deliver government programs to the community professionally, irrespective of our own views and beliefs about those programs or services. And any perceived support for one side of politics or the other immediately undermines the perception of political neutrality that's really essential to be a professional public sector. And for those of us who have been through different changes of government, it's also worth remembering that any undermining of that trust also just makes it very, very difficult for us to do our jobs to the best of our ability. So this is, I guess, thinking back to why it's so important that we remain apolitical and professional. 2014 state election was a very hard-fought election. Following the election, the Victorian Parliament's Electoral Matters Committee conducted an inquiry into the conduct of the election, and it sought the views of all Victorians about how the election was run. So it made a lot of recommendations, the inquiry, and one was that employees should not use government property such as ambulances, fire trucks and uniforms for political purposes and in election campaigns. The government accepted the recommendation, and the Special Minister of State wrote to the Victorian Public Sector Commission asking whether additional guidance material should be issued, and as a result the VPSC has issued guidance on conduct during election periods, and that's available on our website. There's a pretty, as we said, it's part of the Westminster system, so as you'd imagine there's a really strong legislative framework around this requirement to be apolitical. The Public Administration Act has as its main objective an apolitical and professional public sector. The Constitution Act also enshrines the need to be apolitical. Section 95 of the Constitution Act states that an employee in the service of the State of Victoria, whether permanently or temporarily, shall not publicly comment upon the administration of any department of the state, shall not use, except for in the discharge of their duties, any information gained by them in connection with their public service, and shall not indirectly or directly use or attempt to use any influence with respect to remuneration or position of themselves or any person in the public service. So those are the sort of requirements of being apolitical that are enshrined in our Constitution Act. The VPSC also issues a code of conduct, which we'll talk about shortly, and that we do that under the authority of the Public Administration Act. But it's also really important to know that we have rights as well. So under the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities, everyone has the right to participate in public life. That means participating in the conduct of public affairs. It means that everybody has the opportunity without discrimination to vote and be elected at elections and to have access to the Victorian Public Service and to public office. So that means that in Victoria you can be a public sector employee and stand for election. The rights under this Act are limited by other legislation, and in this case the right to participate in public life and to stand for election is limited by the Constitution Act. So we can stand for election, we can participate in public life, but we can't abrogate those responsibilities under the Constitution Act. So what does it mean to be apolitical and professional? The Code of Conduct sets out a number of different areas of activity in which we need to think about being apolitical. One of those, clause 3.9, is public trust, expecting employees to act in a way that doesn't bring the public sector into disrepute. So an example of breaching this area of the code, for example, might be making defamatory comments on social media. Clause 3.8 it covers outside employment, so that's the requirement to obtain approval if you want to carry on outside employment, and that includes volunteering. So the key criteria there, of course, is there a conflict of interest between your public work and your private interests or your outside employment. An example of this would be working for a special interest group that might be lobbying government or lobbying your employer. There's also a general clause on conflict of interest, that's clause 3.7, and outside employment is just one area in which there could be a conflict. So the code requires us to think about what our private interests are and sometimes to subordinate those private interests to our public responsibilities. Political activity is covered by clause 2.2. The code says that we expect employees to remain apolitical and to avoid participating in activities that support a political party or a candidate while at work. So an example of breaching this would be, for example, while you're at work attending a fundraising event for a political party. Public comment is something that can also interfere with our ability to be apolitical. Employees can make public comments in a private capacity, providing it's clear that our comments are our own, but we can't make public comment in an official capacity. Using information and work resources is covered in the Code of Conduct, so in relation to election time, it's not using work information or work resources to support a political party. And also finally, these obligations don't just apply to us as individuals, they apply to we need to also, I guess, monitor what's going on around us as well. So there is an obligation to report misconduct under the code. Now when it comes to standing for election, as I said, Victorian public sector employees are able to stand for election, but this needs to be balanced with our duty or our responsibility to remain apolitical. So the first thing to do would be, if someone wants to stand for election, is to inform their manager, and then there needs to be some working through of how to balance this. And some points to consider will be the nature of a public sector role, someone's access to confidential or sensitive information, and the timing of the election campaign and perhaps the time commitment that's required as well. It might be that more senior employees or employees that have access to particularly confidential or sensitive information, it might be difficult for them to balance those responsibilities and to stand for election. If it's decided that an employee can stand for election, then there's a number of actions that sort of flow from that. This would mean not campaigning at work, not putting up posters, not leaving flyers in areas, not using government resources or equipment such as phone systems or IT equipment, not asking colleagues to assist them in a campaign, not publicly supporting or criticising the policies of a government while you're acting in an official capacity, and that includes not campaigning while wearing a uniform, for example. So just finally, there are some things arrangements that can be put in place for people that wish to stand for election. One of these might be taking time off if there's annual leave or long service leave, and again this depends on the person's role and the nature of their role, and also someone could move to temporary duties. So it's really, we work hard to give good advice to people on how to balance these complex responsibilities. And if a candidate's organisation says no, you can't have time off to stand for an election, you might have an action under the review of actions if you're a public service employee. So that's the end of it for me. Thank you.
Now we get to do more juicy hypotheticals. So there we've got mics, and I'm hoping that everyone will be engaged and, argue every side of every possible argument. So first scenario. During the caretaker period, the opposition announces a policy to build a free scenic chairlift from Spring Street to the Docklands. The next day, the Minister for Tourism and Major Events requests factual advice from the department about available data on the current average commute time from Spring Street to the Docklands during peak times and the public sentiment about the inconvenience associated with that journey, and available data on the likely impact of the scenic chairlift on commute times and commute enjoyment between Spring Street and the Docklands. Should the VPS provide this information? Anyone? I'm not going to get anyone to put up their hands or stand up or anything. I would like someone to be a devil's advocate. If you're not sure, just argue one way.
I'll have a go.
Yes.
I'll have a go. I would have thought yes, just because it's advice. It's not asking to implement a contract.
Mm-hmm.
It's not binding a future government towards a decision.
Mm-hmm.
So I would have thought the provision of factual information is fairly benign.
So the answer was yes, that it was benign, it wasn't implementing anything, it was just factual. Anyone else have another kind of view on this? Or want to agree? Yeah.
The first half of it The data available, yes, but not necessarily the likely impact of the policy.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Yes.
I think because it's a request from the opposition, it would need to be a request to, if it was a minister, to the shadow minister to be to the minister, or the Premier would need to be informed.
So so the opposition announced a policy, and the Minister for Tourism requests. So in this scenario.
Yeah.
Anyone else have anything else to add? So I think that's correct. There is one way to kind of see this, to say, look, it's just, you know, factual information that they're asking. It's about available data, etc. And there is the other way to see it, which is, well, you know, it's, although on its face it looks like it's just factual information, it's apparent from the advice that it's not, it wouldn't have been probably sought if it's not for the opposition's announcement. So it looks like it's likely, and it can be inferred, that, you know, they're asking for this data in order to criticise the opposition's announcement, you know, in its campaigning for this. Can people see that?
Yep.
Yeah. So in this case, we would actually advise you not to provide this information, and that's you know, and look, I make a note that this is during the caretaker period. Okay, I think if it's before the caretaker period, we need to continue as business as usual. But there is a real difference between giving policy advice, which we shouldn't be doing during the caretaker period, but generally there's a real difference between giving policy advice and giving advice that's going to lead to someone's platform, for example, during the election campaign. So just to note, requests should be limited to factual information and admin support that's necessary for the day-to-day running of the government, so during the caretaker period. So just remember that. And basically that although we can't be giving policy advice during this period, even if it's just follow-up from earlier policy advice that's been asked for, that the VPS can continue to do the policy work, but provided that there isn't any interaction between the VPS and the minister during this time. Okay, so I will move on to the next scenario. In this case, in early 2018, the government went to tender for the outsourcing of a major government service. The tender process followed government commitments given in December 2015. The tender process has been protracted. About 4 weeks prior to the caretaker period commencing, the Minister's Office instructs DPC to finalise contract negotiations and enter the contract as soon as possible. Contract signing is scheduled for the 26th of October, 2 business days before caretaker starts, should DPC facilitate the signing of the contract on the eve of the caretaker. Does anyone have any views on this? Anyone? Who says it's okay? Can you explain why you think it's okay? It's because it's before the caretaker period. Anyone else want to think the other way? Or yep, that is in fact correct. I think we've mentioned a few times. It's business as usual before the caretaker period starts, and you know, the government remains in office, so we shouldn't be stopping the way we do things. It will obviously be different if it ends up, the negotiations ends up to end within the caretaker period and you're required to sign within the caretaker period. You can't do that. So I just want to draw everyone's attention to the contact details that we have. Please call us on the hotline if you've got any questions that you want to talk through with someone or tricky situations, or email us at that email address and we will get back to you.